We have nothing under old business. I will call a public hearing to order. Under new business on the public hearing, our first item is public hearing consideration action on resolution setting the 2011 property tax millage rate. And I will make one statement, since these are a public hearing, we'll accept public comments on all three items. Plus, we will still also have public comments. Mr. Chairman, give us a report on that.
Thank you, Mayor. You'll direct your attention to your screens. I have a very brief presentation on the tax year 2011 millage rate. As everyone knows, council's seen a lot of these before, and I apologize for the repetition, but a teacher told me one time that it takes several times to go over things before a lot of people understand it. They directed that specifically at me, so sometimes have to go over things many times where I can understand myself. There are three primary bases of taxation: the income tax, or basis income tax, consumption-based taxes, or the sales tax, or taxations on wealth, which gets reflected in the property tax. Typically, the income tax is reserved amongst other taxes, but primarily the income tax is a federal tax, although the state of Georgia taxes all three of these bases. Primarily, they tax income and consumption. They pretty much leave the taxing of property to localities, counties, cities, and special districts. We do have a little bit of consumption-based tax in the form of SPLOS, which, as everyone knows, are approved periodically for capital projects. But primarily, in terms of these three forms of taxation, property taxation is left to local governments. Unfortunately, the state gives us the least popular of all the taxes in the property tax. People would generally focus on the tax rate when they discuss the property tax. And the numerical value of the tax rate is a highly charged, political, and sometimes emotional issue. There are other factors to consider: the assessment values and the amount of taxes that are actually paid. And I would submit that the focus needs to be on the amount paid and the value of the service received. One of our favorite expressions around here: A times B equals C. How we calculate the property tax, where A is the assessed value of property, B is our property tax rate, and C is the property tax rate to be paid. The city can control B and C, we can't control A. And C is always a factor of A, and we have to keep that in mind. With that said, we can take a look at the last 20 years or so of our assessed value in Snellville. You can see for the first 18 years of that, there are only 2 years where assessed values actually went down. But we are now experiencing our third straight year of declining values as far as assessed value of property is concerned inside the city. And it's kind of hard to see, I think, on the big screen, but you can see it on your small screens. If you look at where we are in 2011, which is the tax year we're in now, and just draw a straight line back across, you see that we're, in terms of assessed value, we're back on to where we were in 2004. We peaked in 2008 and have gone down every year since then. And since 2008, we've experienced approximately a 19% decline in assessed valuation of property inside the city of Snellville. As I mentioned earlier, A times B equals C. We can control B, we can control C, but we can't control A. And our assessed values have been declining, and that's something that does affect our property tax revenues and our property tax rates. Because of that, the increases that you saw for most of those years, and this was a phenomenon that was going on all across the country, really. Most states passed what are generically considered to be truth in taxation laws. And in the state of Georgia, we have one as well. We refer to that process as the rollback rate. And the idea there was that as property values went up simply because of inflation and the growth in property values, that what cities could not do was experienced a windfall profit, if you will, from simply leaving their millage rates where they were and taking advantage of those rising assessments. So the state of Georgia developed what they call the rollback rate, which is a calculation that each city has to go through every year to subtract from their taxes the millage equivalent of the total net assessed values added by the reassessments. In other words, the growth in property values that did not come from new construction or annexation or actual real growth, but simply came in increasing values of property. And what this means is the city can receive additional property tax revenues based solely on these increases in assessed values. Well, as we mentioned earlier, assessed values have been going down, and so we still are required to calculate the rollback rate. You can see that the rollback calculation for 2011, the tax year we're talking about tonight. And you can see from the 2010 digest that the net value added from reassessments was actually a negative number. In other words, reassessments went down over $68 million between 2010 and 2011. Now, we did get a little over $13 million in actual new growth and new development, but we have a total 2011 digest of $692,435,030, which is much less than the 2010 digest of $747 million. We continue to do the calculation, but we actually end up with a negative number because the 2011 digest is less than the 2010 digest. And as we all remember from ninth grade algebra, when you subtract a negative number, you're actually adding. So in this case, the rollback rate didn't go down or back, it went up. And the rollback rate for 2011 is 6.486 mils. This is the millage rate that's designed to produce the same amount of property tax dollars that was produced in 2010 with a 5.9 millage rate. In other words, it takes a 6.486 millage rate to generate, in 2011, to generate the same amount of money in tax dollars that a 5.9 millage rate did in 2010. When we put together the budget, we went through and determined our expenditure levels that were necessary to maintain our current service levels and do the things that we wanted to do within the budget. We determined all the revenues that were available from all the other sources. Since we didn't have the assessments in at that time, we essentially put a budget together without knowing what the assessed values were going to be, but knowing the amount of revenue that we needed to come from property taxes. So this is what I term the budget gap. We look at our expenditure totals, how much came from non-property tax revenues, and the amount that needed to come from the property tax, and that amount was $4,050,000. We budgeted $4.3 million in property tax revenues in fiscal year 2011. So this amount is less than what was budgeted as a property tax revenue in 2011. So to go back and solve for B, which is the property tax rate, we took that $4,050,000, which is the amount of revenue that we needed to generate. We divided that by what a mill or what the total assessments were. And we multiply that number by 0.945. That is our collection rate. In other words, we collect about 94.5% of the property taxes that are actually levied in that year. And that is a pretty consistent number historically. We went back and looked over the last 6 years and took an average from the actual collection rate over that last 6-year period. So if we calculate those numbers, we come up with a necessary millage rate of 6.19 mils to fund the proposed budget. This looks at some comparisons of the tax digest, the millage rate, the taxes levied, and the tax collected. The first column is actual fiscal year 2011. The middle column is what the rollback rate, using the rollback rate of 6.482 mils is, and actually using the millage rate of 6.19, which is what's necessary to generate property tax revenues necessary for the adopted 2012 budget. So one of the questions, I guess, that people ask is this an increase in taxes or is it a decrease in taxes? And maybe the answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no. The current tax rate is 5.9 mils. The calculated rollback rate that we talked about is 6.486 mils. The proposed tax rate that is necessary to fund the adopted budget is 6.19 mils. In fiscal year 2011, we actually collected $4,154,384 in property taxes. We were estimating the 2012 taxes to be $4,050,000. So we were actually looking at total taxes collected in fiscal year 2012 as being less than what was collected in 2011. So with that, Mayor, I'm glad to answer any questions about the proposed millage rate of 6.19 mils.
Is there any questions of the city manager based on that? Yes, Ms. Cowles.
Mr. Treadway, what is the difference with the current property values that we were given? What is the difference we would collect with the 5.9 mils current or the projected rate of 6.19 mils?
That difference is approximately $190,000.
I think earlier you had emailed 122,000. Have you recalculated that number?
I don't remember 122, but that is a recalculation based on the final assessments.
Any other questions? Okay, what I'll do is I'll entertain a motion, and then we'll open up the floor to public comment.
Mr. Mayor,
Chair recognizes Ms. Pender.
I'd like to make a motion that the mayor and city council adopt a millage rate for the fiscal year ending 2012 of 5.7 mils.
There's a motion. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Second by Mr. Witz. Ms. Pender, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through my budget calculations, I can see that we can actually reduce the millage rate this year and still maintain the budget that we passed for this coming fiscal year. We did have a surplus that was showing in the past budget, so that will reducing the millage rate will actually eat a little bit into that planned surplus, but it still should allow the city to have a surplus at the end. So I'll be happy to entertain any other questions if needed.
Mr. Witz, you seconded.
No further comment.
Okay. What I'd like to do is open up the floor to public comment, and we can go back to the discussion if that's okay. All right, I'll open the floor to any public comment. I'll need your name and address for the record. Please come forward, state your name and address for the record.